Mark, let me start with you. When I first watched this, I was really struck that it seemed to be sort of several different stories all at once. One that's the obvious story of the tabloidization of our culture, but it's also this sort of really juicy, rich story about a perhaps ethically questionable American entrepreneur. And then it's this other story about our president and these very corrupt practices between him and a major media outlet. What story do you feel like you are telling?
You know, for us, we decided really early on that the main character of this film was the Enquirer itself. And so, like any character in any compelling film, that character goes through a trajectory and, you know, has an origin story and then proceeds to morph and transform over the course of a film. And the Enquirer was ideally suited for that because that's exactly what happened. I mean, it was sort of like a Frankenstein story in a way, invented by this sort of mad scientist back in the late 50s and sort of morphing from gore into something that was a sort of anesthesia for middle America or Americans to sort of escape from what was going on in the 70s. And that falling into the hands of a completely different mad fill-in-the-blank many decades later was a fascinating story to watch how it went from what it was doing to just plain political propaganda. It was just, that was the trajectory that was just sort of in the cut, that was there.
And how much did you know that when you were starting, and how much of it sort of emerged? Were you surprised by what you found, or what story you found you were telling?
I think I had a sense of the arc sort of at the onset, because, you know, we were seeing it unfolding before our eyes, but, you know, we started filming before any of the stories in the New Yorker broke, with the exception of Jeffrey Toobin's story. In July of 2017, the term catch and kill was not in the lexicon at all. We didn't know what it was, and we hadn't heard of Karen McDougal or the Doorman or Stephanie Clifford, any of it. That actually started to unfold as we were making the film, which was very strange.
And somewhat exciting, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Because a good story is a good story.
Exciting for the film and not so exciting for our society.
Oh, democracy?
Yeah.
Yes. So see, let me ask you a question. You know, you started at the Enquirer, you were there a long time, you were the executive editor, and your tenure was before the sort of the Frankenstein monster fully realized with Pecker and Trump. Yet ethical questions abounded before then. What made you want to work there?
Well, it paid a very healthy salary. And I think that one thing I noticed, and I've talked to Mark about this, is the question of ethics in journalism, right? You got to remember the mission of the National Enquirer. The mission you signed on for was to sell newspapers. And the Enquirer didn't make any bones about that when I was there. That was our mission, to sell newspapers. So our reporters were very good at getting information. Some of the tactics pushed the envelope. Some of the tactics in the film were extraordinary and perhaps used once or twice. But our mission was to sell papers, and now the problem that we're finding ourselves in is that mission is being compared to journalism. So the two have sort of merged a bit, and that's where I think the conflict and the confusion comes in.
Did you not think of yourself as a journalist?
We thought of ourselves as getting the story that would sell newspapers. Is that the definition of a journalist? Well, really? Think about it. Think about it.
We're going to get to this. Hold your seat, Ken. Go for it.
I mean, if repeatedly in this movie, and if you look at the headlines of your paper when you were the editor, not just when David Pecker was, I mean, first of all, the Bob Hope story, the Bill Cosby story, Catch and Kill then, long before Donald Trump. Were you the editor then?
No. I came into the Enquirer as a reporter in 81. I took over as editor-in-chief 95 to 2003.
So you were working
When was
at
the
the
Cosby
Enquirer
story?
then? You were
Cosby
working at
story
the
references before I walked in the door.
Did you approve of that? What they did with Bob, killing of Bob Hope?
I was unaware of that until this movie.
Really?
Before my time. That's 77.
Let's just press you on the notion that you're not a journalist, but you're interested in selling newspapers. And the presumption is that all of us who are in journalism, that's our main goal.
No, I'm saying that's the difference between the tabloids and journalists. However, one thing missing from this entire discussion is the dirty word capitalism. You don't start a magazine to lose money. You don't start a media company to not make money. And when money is needed, perhaps boundaries are pushed. The Enquirer didn't have that concern because our goal was to sell newspapers.
What about a concern for the truth? What about a concern, is the story true?
Totally, that was a huge concern of the Enquirers. And that's why this expression of exploding the nub is extremely important to this documentary. There was always a germ of truth.
But wait, a germ of truth?
Always. And then we would take that and present it in the most sensational fashion possible to sell newspapers.
But what if the germ of truth wasn't true?
Actually, that did happen. It does happen to every newspaper.
Right.
And we're not perfect.
Well, wait,
It's more than a germ. I guess that's a bad word.
right. Tabloid papers are covered under the same protections as the rest of newspapers, aren't they?
That's why we had the president's lawyer.
Right, but I'm saying, not to totally gang up on you here, I actually do have other questions, but
I don't feel gang up.
I'm going to imagine you have tough skin. If they are covered by the same protections, then in a way you're just splitting hairs about what you are. I mean,
What did I say? It was split hairs. I said we're going after.
Well,
Our job is
you are
to get stories
journalists or
to
you're
sell.
not journalists.
Your job as a journalist should be to get stories that affect America and affect the world. There was a great anecdote in there about, was it Donald splitting with Marla, and way down bottom was Nelson Mandela that got out of prison. I mean,
Well, I think that's
Carl
questionable.
Bernstein pointed that out.
Well,
It was
yeah.
a big story,
Yeah.
right?
which you downplayed.
Well,
No,
let
that
me-
was not the National Enquirer.
Ken, let me ask you a question. Is there a role for the tabloid press in the larger journalism ecosystem?
Sure, there's no question about that. And not to deny that you broke good stories on Gary Hart and O.J. Simpson and Edwards when he was running for president. But those are minuscule points versus the larger point, which is that a lot of what the National Enquirer does is not about searching for the truth. It's about searching to sell newspapers. And I could sell newspapers by creating a tabloid and say that Donald Trump is homosexual. It wouldn't be true, but it's
You're taking it way around the bend. The National Enquirer was covering celebrity gossip. That's where we made our money. That's where we made our bones. It was gossip. Who's sleeping with who? Who's divorcing who? And then a major celebrity murder happened in the middle of us covering sexy gossip. And that's really where the wheels kind of come off and everything gets a little confusing. So we would never do what you're just saying. We were covering gossip, hair parlor gossip. That's what the National Enquirer was doing.
But gossip need not be true. If it's
We
salacious.
hoped it was true, and we did everything in our power to make sure it was true. We did everything in our power. We chased it as truthfully as we could.
So let me jump in. There's obviously, this is a fraught area, so I'm curious, Mark, how did you sort of walk this line of both telling this story, which raises all of these questions and has all of these ethical conundrums, and yet, you know, you obviously have a decent relationship with one of the main people. He's sitting here with us. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about handling that?
I mean, this is why we made the film. We made the film because we're at a point in our culture where there's so much confusion in journalism. There's so much smoke and mirrors and misinformation. And I think that we need to understand that this is ultimately, fundamentally, a question of media literacy. You know, does the public understand where their news is coming from? Is that source a reliable source that has a track record of fact-based reporting, you know, based on what Woodward and Bernstein called the best obtainable version of truth? Or is it a tabloid that is about sensationalizing the truth and exploding the nub and filling our, supermarkets and a lot of Americans' minds with all kinds of stuff. Fantasy, fantasy. And that fantasy happens to be mixed on occasion with legitimate journalism. They were responsible for discovering the Bruno Magli shoes that resulted in the Goldman family winning the civil trial. They were instrumental in reporting on John Edwards and his Cosby. So I think it's so interesting in American culture, we're so interested in the culprit. We all want to point the finger. It's their fault. Brooke Gladstone calls it the influencing machine. Maggie Haberman calls it the media god. This idea that there's just this giant media pulling the levers, making Americans do everything. I think what's missing in that is the mirror. And that is the complicity, right? So the complicity in the American public. Do you gossip? Do you even say it? We are all in some ways participants in this. And I think a lot of people bought the Enquirer at the height of its day. 7 million people were buying it, but that meant 25 million people were reading it. And it was the early form of social media. It was the template for viral news. And most of it was not true. So,
That would take exception.
well,
Saying
Not our
most of it was not true.
sensationalized version of.
There you go.
was it the best
That's
attainable
totally
version of the
different.
truth?
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I mean, when they, where did I read this? That some of the earliest graffiti discovered in ancient Rome during some excavation was basically sexual innuendos. Pompeii, thank you, was sexual innuendos against leaders. I mean, gossip as a form of communication is not a new thing. You have the yellow press, you have the penny press. So I do think this question of where it fits into the larger media ecosystem is a legitimate question, and I feel like this is sort of a story of a runaway beast, of sort of what happens when it goes too far, falls in the wrong hands. It was a comment, but I assume somebody will want to comment back.
I think one of the greatest things about this film, obviously, it shows both the good and the bad of the tabloids and the good and bad in journalism, is that we're actually discussing what a fact is. And I know that I have large differences with Mark on various publications that everyone says they are always right, they're always factual. I disagree with that. The tabloids are less factual, I'll give you that, more sensational. But there isn't a publication out there that isn't factually challenged right now. But now everyone's starting to I hope, come around to that viewpoint and start digesting where the facts are and where they're not. And social media is part of that. And the younger generation is much better at this than my generation because they can access 6 to 7 different sources simultaneously to get to what the facts are.
I just would beg to differ slightly, Steve, with, the idea that, it's not, always factual. I think if you take a publication, say the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Globe or the Sun-Times, and if they publish something that is untrue, you're going to get a retraction. But you don't get retraction. To my knowledge, in making the film and spending 1.5 years with you guys, I never heard anybody, with the exception of when there was a threat of a libel suit, then you get a retraction. So I do think that this is part of the problem, that suddenly there's this idea that our fourth estate is not to be trusted. That is really deeply troubling.
I think that's healthy. I think it's a healthy public skepticism. And if I remember correctly, I'm sure Ken will remember this and Heather much better than me. Didn't the New York Times put out a headline 2 months ago that they got pressured on social media for being too pro-Trump? So they pulled it back to make it less pro-Trump? Now, where does that fit into this world?
If you go back and look at that headline, look at the story that the headline represented. The story was a brilliant, tough story on Trump. The headline was a mistake, and they corrected it in the second or third edition of the paper. But you're making an argument. There is no question that one of the big issues in our society today is what is truth. And do you trust what you read or hear from the press? And I would make the argument, with all due respect to the scoops you have had and the good news that you have broken, that the National Enquirer bears some large responsibility, as do many other in the press and in social media, for basically dwarfing or distorting the idea of what is true, because people take what they read in the National Enquirer over the years as true, and much of it was not. A germ of truth is not truth.
A germ's too less a word, but I think you have to look at the... No, I said exploded not, didn't I?
No, you said germ. You used the word germ.
I meant gem.
Mark, I'm curious what you think. You just spent a year and a half on this. Do you agree with Kim?
You know,
How much blame can we give to the National Enquirer, since we like to point fingers?
I mean, where do you start with the blame? Do you want to blame William Randolph Hearst?
I was going to say, this is not me.
Shall we go back to the penny? I mean, we can go back to, you know, the founding fathers. I mean, this dates back to people in power using the press in all kinds of ways. And this is, you know, everybody in this room knows it. So I think, you know, but I do think it's problematic what's happening in journalism, you know, that we're even having that we have Carl Bernstein standing up there expressing a collective concern that we can't agree on a fact. That's very Rashomon, and that's scary. Who wants to live in a Rashomon society where 7 people see completely different things based on the echo chamber that they live in? That's very disturbing. So this is why we made the film, but I just want to touch on something that Steve said, because I'm grateful to him for sitting here, and I'm grateful to the women and the men at the National Enquirer for letting us in. Why would they do that? Because their story is important. It's important for us to understand our media landscape. And you know, the Enquirer, you know, I'm quoting Brooke a lot tonight, but in her book she says, you know, we get the media we deserve. It's a disturbing pill to swallow, but we get the media we deserve. Carl Bernstein said the same thing to me. We didn't make it into the film. He said, you know, people like to think that the press and the culture around the press are 2 completely different things, when in reality they're just a reflection of each other. So I just think that hopefully, you know, we made the film not to like take people to the gallows. That's very, very popular in our culture. Let's hang them out. Let's blame them. But by doing that, we free ourselves from any sense of complicity in it. And, you know, that's the problem with the country right now. You know, we have people who live over on this side and people who live in the places in between the other side, and everybody thinks they're right. So I'm not saying that, well, I'm not going to say that. So I'll stop myself. You know, I mean, there's truth. There's truth and there's fact, and I err on that side. But I didn't make the film to drag these people out and tar and feather them. I made the film because why not hear their story? Why not, you know, and why not tell it in as honest a way as possible? And why not include people like Ken and Maggie and Carl to give us, and Keith Kelly, thankfully, to give us a little bit of a sense of context.
I would just make the point that and I was not claiming that the source of evil in society and distortion of news stems from the National Enquirer. And yes, you can go back many centuries, I agree with that. And you can blame the public, I agree with that. But the notion that you expressed before, I think is the germ of a poison in the society, which is if you're out to sell newspapers or out to sell ratings for your TV. If you watch television today, local television, you look at what's happening online, you see people looking for attention and distorting news for sensational reasons. Not necessarily because they're lying, in some cases it's true. And I think the reason for that is largely the one you express, which is you're about selling newspapers, selling news, getting an audience. And I think that's a disease.
Right, but to peg that back to the Enquirer, I think that's where I have a problem. One, and you'll know which network. One of the networks recently, within the past 2 or 3 weeks, spiked the story because it would not allow them.
ABC.
It wouldn't. Prince William's wife, Kate, they wouldn't be able to get there. I'll challenge you tomorrow night. Go home, watch any one of the network world news shows. I don't care which one, and then watch Inside Edition. You will see a 20 to 40% overlap. And I'll even make a case that Inside Edition does a better production value of it. So that's the world we live in. You can't blame that on the Enquirer.
Let's try to take the conversation off whether or not it's the National Enquirer's fault. Because I do think probably in the last 150 years there have been more success of yellow journalism or tabloid than what we would think of as objective. Or else I'll see what you guys think about this, that the sort of fundamental tension is that newspapers in this country are simultaneously public goods, purveyors of the truth, and commercial enterprises that, especially in recent years, have increasingly been taken over by private equity funds and the kinds of companies that really want to make a profit beyond anything else. And something else that really hit me during the film was two things. One, the origin story that he notices that people like to watch car wrecks, right? So if we sort of take that as a fundamental human attribute, and then we also talk about that there's that great line where Phil Donahue says, "It's not trash, it's a great story." So the coin of our realm is a great story, yet we're simultaneously supposed to be this above it all purveyors of the truth, and I don't know how to reconcile that tension. Ken, let me start with you.
I don't think you can reconcile it. I mean, you just accept the complexity, that both can be true at the same time. Period.
And you don't think that maybe we're seeing the sort of potential race to the bottom of that tension?
Oh, I do. I mean, if both are true, the question is which is the operative or predominant truth, and I think the race to the bottom is a more predominant truth today, and it's of great concern. I mean, Pat Moynihan, when he was senator, once said that you're entitled to your own opinions, you're not entitled to your own facts. And increasingly, people invent facts that make them comfortable.
Or twist, or color, or polish, or shade. Your point about conglomerates is a great point. Because if you think about what happened at the Enquirer, where one man came in and slowly twisted it into a political propaganda, at least on the cover, to influence politics. Now think about the conglomerates that are now doing this. And we haven't even touched on social media, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a really difficult time. And again, I'll say this. I don't think there's any right or wrong. We know where we should be. And hopefully this movie would drive the conversation so people will discuss it openly and figure it out.
You know, I don't think that the real problem is the fact that the Enquirer published, fake-ish stories. I think the problem is when people can't tell the difference. And I think that's the greatest concern. And I think, the Enquirer of Steve's era and before that and General Pope's era is a markedly different beast than the one that it is under AMI and David Pecker. And I think that's a whole other animal. I mean, it's one thing to trade out a story of Bob Hope having a casting couch at Universal and all the practices that were commonplace in Hollywood at the time, particularly under the studio system. I mean, Louis B. Mayer was a pig, So,
Judy Garland.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think the problem is that now you have a very powerful media institution, as far back as several, 20 years ago, using its money and its resources to say, okay, hypothetically speaking, X person slept with the nanny, okay? So whereas Bob Hope may have slept with the nanny, we would trade that out and say, okay, we're not going to run the nanny story if you let us spend Thanksgiving with you and Dolores or whatever her name was at home. How charming. Now we're going to lure the nanny into a situation where she is convinced that her story is going to get told. And so she is going to meet you and you're going to promise her a book or a movie contract or the opportunity to vocalize what actually happened to her, which is 9 out of 10 times something intensely abusive, most likely. And I think Ronan Farrow's book points this out exceptionally well. And then we're going to make you sign this document, and we're going to basically essentially put a gag on you for the rest of your life. In all media, in perpetuity, in every outlet in the universe. And that's the thing that's so disturbing about what's going on now. That didn't happen back in the day. It was different.
That's the definition.
And it has political consequences that affect all of us. Who cares if Bob Hope... I mean, look, it was horrible, but did it affect our daily lives? But what recently happened with Catch and Kill has affected every single person in this room, whether you like it or not.
And one other point, the difference between Catch and Kill and, let's say, horse trading. If the Enquirer, if you came to the Enquirer and said you were sleeping with Bob Hope's mistress, let's use somebody more current, but I'll leave out names, And we didn't want to run it, we just wouldn't run it. That person had other outlets to go to. The Catch and Kill totally puts that person in a box and throws it in a box.
I just want to say, I agree with what you just said, but I want to go back to the movie. And I want to go back to the John Belushi. I want to go back to some of the people, your staff and former editor, predecessors editor, talked about what they did commonly to get stories. Getting that woman to say things, the drug who gave the heroin to John Belushi, and then get her going to jail because of it. And your colleague says, I feel guilty about that. You should feel more than guilty about that. Some of the things that those people on your staff and your predecessors were saying in that movie were appalling in terms of means and ends.
I hate to take a total cop-out on this, but I was not in charge of Belushi's death. I was a reporter. When did Belushi die? Anybody remember?
78.
82. I arrived at the Enquirer in 81, so I was a reporter, probably in Mexico, somewhere around the world. But I understand what those reporters are saying in the rush of getting the story. They themselves said in the film that they went too far and felt bad about it.
But that film dissects a culture, the culture of the National Enquirer, over a period of 20 some odd years, which is, I found, pretty appalling.
So this comes right to the next question I was going to ask. There's a lot of sadness in the movie when Pecker comes in. You are, very, bitter is too strong a word, but unhappiness, and there's sort of this big delineation of, oh, this terrible guy came in and ruined everything. But sort of to what Ken is saying, I definitely found myself wondering as I watched him, was not the end results built into the DNA of the thing itself in some ways?
I'm missing the question. I don't quite get it.
It doesn't...
You mean the ethics of it?
Not even specifically the ethics, the culture of the place. I mean, was it not sort of doomed to self-destruct in some horrid way from the beginning?
The Belushi is an extreme case, and I think the reporters you saw on the screen explain that. But it's a doomed culture from various reasons, not through the practices. It's a doomed culture because of the TV shows coming in. It's a doomed culture because of TMZ. The competition is instantaneous. Remember, when you're in print, you have to actually print and distribute. You're a dinosaur in a social media age. So that's why the Enquirer's down to 150 or 200,000. They can't compete in the marketplace.
Right. Mark, what do you think?
I was just going to say the word that's coming to my mind right now is metastasis. It's like this thing comes on and morphs and sort of spreads off and becomes hard copy and a current affair and Entertainment Tonight and all that stuff, and which leads us to Perez Hilton and TMZ and the Drudge Report, and which leads us eventually to the Twitterverse. It just keeps going and going and going. So it's not about a single publication. It's about a culture that has an obsession and, frankly, an addiction to gossip, to the rise and the fall of the rich and the powerful, and give me more. It's like it's an opiate, and I think that's the real problem. It's like any great really freaky alien movie. It's like the alien morphs. It's like and it's. I think we just have to. Again, I just keep going back to you just got to call it what it is and be very clear, much in the same way that we mind what we eat, ideally, you gotta mind what kind of media you're consuming and know that, okay, I'm taking my Us Weekly dose. I mean, I will tell you, Maggie Haberman had such a funny thing. After the interview wrapped, I said to her, and I really wanted to use it in the film, but I couldn't figure out how. I said, so do you read it? She's like, what? I said, do you read the National Enquirer? She goes, no. I said, never? She goes, never. And she pauses, and she looks at me, and she smiles, she goes, I'm more of an Us Weekly. She looks at us as a journalist, okay? So, I mean, I think that we're all a little bit rubbernecking and looking at the car crash. I'm not condoning it, I think it's terrible.
Back to your question, I was thinking, because there's a slow demise, at some point the Enquirer's not going to exist. Little known factoid, when Entertainment Tonight launched, that was offered to Generoso Pope. So the Enquirer would have, morphed into this TV show that's now Entertainment Tonight. He refused it because the production company would not give him 100% control, which I think you can see comes through in Mark's piece.
So this is a question I found myself asking people a lot lately. How optimistic are you feeling?
Not very, but
Seriously, I mean, we're sitting here being like, yeah, there's no such thing as truth.
no. I'm not. When I think with my head, I'm not optimistic. But I can't live my life that way. I don't want to wake up with that pessimism. So in my stomach, I'm more optimistic, and I think that's a healthy way to live.
I will say that I actually, I have heroes that I didn't have growing up. So I have heroes like Peter Baker and Mike Schmidt and Ashley Parker and Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohey and, and David Remnick. I have heroes. I have people who are putting their lives on the line to make sure that we are seeing what's going on. And and there's a renaissance in journalism because of that. I mean, Ken, please tell me, because I wasn't, but people say it rivals, if not surpasses, the journalism that was happening in Watergate. And thank God for it. I am optimistic, yes, because there are people that are speaking truth to power and using their platforms to do it. And I think we've seen the Enquirer ridiculed. And I think that I don't see how a $100 million investment from the Hudson Media Group is going to do a damn bit to revive this thing. Because how do you come back from that? How do you come back from what it's done with evidence to back it to our political landscape? So I think the challenge is to get how do we restore faith when people are so like my aunt and uncle in Chicago, you can't have a political conversation with them. It's just infuriating because the sky is not blue. It's not blue. It's a very
That's your opinion.
Steve,
no, it's
I was going to say, Steve, do you share the rest of our sort of sense of horror?
I think we're all sitting here like pundits, and we're in the business, and the only way we're going to know if there's any optimism is to actually ask the audience to ask the questions, which will then tell us if we're having any impact here in this discussion and in this film.
So you want to turn it over to the audience?
You're the moderator.
What do you guys think? Ready?
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I'm running the mic, so I'm just handing it. Oh,
Yeah, I got the mic. Good evening. First of all, amazing documentary. I've been waiting for this forever. Actually, I know this audience is New America, and I'm just as American as I am African. And I'm really excited about this documentary just because, in terms of for me, I'm gonna direct my question to Steve. Just because of the business model, there's never been a phenomenon. I work a lot with Africa. We've never had a phenomenon like the National Enquirer. We've never had anybody that grabbed the audience like this. It might be tabloids and, maybe this is where we are as a society. We like to gossip. We like to see other people in a bad situation. And this is global. It's not just in America. It's everywhere. Every woman at home that's miserable in their life, or she's taking care of way too many people, likes to see this. What I'm interested in is the tactics. How you guys got there. Maybe it's not the best platform. Maybe it's not so relevant today. Maybe the millennials are more interested in good stories and empowering stories, and at the time that was a different story. But the tactics was so brilliant. I really commend you on that. I don't know if I'm asking a question or telling you.
Are you from the CIA?
No, I'm not, I promise.
There was a formula involved in the Enquirer, in the Universal Post.
Oh, really?
A formula, mix of stories.
I wish you could share, in terms of that brilliance, how could we transform that to a better world, to better content, to truth, or whatever other people want to look at. Where I come from, we don't really care about truth. Most of our leaders are not truthful, so...
Let me, just because we have so little time, do you want to take any stab at that?
I think we're having that discussion right now.
Okay, who's next? I have no control, it's the mic person.
Hi, I just have a question. You were talking, two of you mentioned the John Edwards story, which many people have written about, that is the first time it really jumped, where a story was uncovered fully by the Enquirer and moved over and became a key point in the presidential campaign, unlike the Gary Hart saying where he said, follow me. The John Edwards story was a major story, and I was just wondering what the process was that it wasn't really mentioned in the film.
Because the John Edwards story was essentially a redundancy, because the Hart story had no proof. Initially, the Miami Herald broke the story, and they tailed Hart, and they traced him to Georgetown and followed him, and Donna Rice into his townhome, and they went out the back, but they didn't have any proof, real proof. And the Enquirer broke that story, and while Gary dropped out of the race, this is the story that Matt Bai and others attest was the moment, the real moment. So there's so many stories, thousands in the Enquirer, and over a 60-year period, we had to make some distinctions, and John Edwards just wasn't a pivotal moment. It was a moment that they got some credit, but it wasn't transformational for the paper and the culture. And so we had to make decisions based on that, otherwise we'd have like a 4-hour film.
Steve, I have to ask, how are you still alive?
What, from
Well, I'm sure at times you were afraid for your life.
after Princess died, it was very difficult for my family. But I did get an enormous ficus hedge around my property. Wire with a fence through it.
Okay,
Electrified.
my second question is, did your good looks afford you entree into the world? Because you also look like a movie star. So that has to be part of how you were so successful.
No, it was my Harvard brilliance. It was described in the New York Times. I was the perfect person to stumble into the Enquirer after GP, because I grew up in a blue-collar town. I went to Harvard, so I had this blue-collar mentality tied to a Harvard education, which is what the gentleman described as the Nantucket bartender.
Great description. All right, we have a bunch up front. Thank you.
Hi, this is maybe a question for Mr. Oletta, but for all of you really. You know, in the 50s and 60s, the Washington Post and the Washington Star, like lamented, you know, never bothered to cover, you know, Jack Kennedy's Addison's disease or any of his other things, you know, that were peccadillos. Those were ignored. So that's one issue that there's always been a sort of a sense of noblesse oblige among the media. So this is not new, and you go back to Horace Greeley and the New York World. I mean, this is the issue of selling papers. I mean, that is, of course, the way it's a private enterprise. So that, I mean, that's one issue. But the other thing is really about what we're seeing today. The economics of journalism have changed so much that real journalism isn't occurring. We're seeing on CNN and the major media outlets, we're seeing a lot of punditry. We're not seeing actual reporting. We're not seeing correspondence in the far reaches of the world. We're seeing people sitting in a studio in New York or Washington.
Let me just, we have so little time to get to the
Right,
question.
Right, the question is, so how do we actually get the facts when we don't have journalists actually doing journalism?
Because we do. We do have journalists. But if you look at, yes, you were right. You watch these shows on, regardless of what stripe it is, from Fox to MSNBC to CNN, and you will see a bunch of pundits. But who are they calling up there? They're calling up frontline journalists who are working for print publications. Those are the people who are doing the work.
I disagree with that. I agree with your point totally. I was watching about a month ago when we pulled our troops out of Syria, and there was a network that was interviewing their correspondent on why we had pulled the troops out of Syria. Meanwhile, on the other network, they had the live Trump press conference where he's explaining why he did it. So I think that's a problem.
I think that I agree with the notion that there's too many talking heads in television studios. But if you look at the reporting in the New York Times, which you mentioned earlier, and the Washington Post, they're doing sensational reporting, investigative reporting, exposing Donald Trump's lies daily. and the environment and the challenges we face. So I think television is a major culprit, particularly cable television, with the talking heads, etc., and lines with this. I think they have the biggest news organization in the world, and yet they don't report on what's going on in Syria in the evening. They do worldwide, they do, but they have these people, David Axelrod and others, in the studio, and I don't think that's why do they do that? Because it's cheap.
It's one of the great paradoxes, I think, of this moment, that even as journalism is undoubtedly in crisis, there's actually a huge amount of fabulous journalism with all the objectives that are already being done. The problem is it's not fulfilling the function of the free press in the sense that none of us trust each other. We all have our facts, our own sets of facts, yet at the same time, a huge amount of fabulous journalism that more people than ever before are reading exists. It's a strange paradox. We're trying to get one last question, and please be so brief, no context, just throw the question out there.
Okay, I have 2 questions.
Just one, 2 questions.
Okay, fine. So one of the topics, I guess, that I wanted to discuss, and I don't remember if it was under Steve, but it was the point of diversifying the kind of stories that were being covered in the National Enquirer, and I'm just curious to know a bit about how that developed and how that changed the audience, but then also where was traditional journalism, like the New York Times and Washington Post, reflecting maybe the audience that is America and the diversity of it, and I'm just curious to know that topic about diversity in journalism.
Thank you.
I think that was covered in the movie Under Me, when Pat Ship, who's a scene reporter and a future Elliot Bureau chief, gets up and talks about me bringing diversity into the newsroom. Yeah, we brought a lot of different cultures into the newsroom, because if you look at America back then, it's very similar to today. You look at the National Enquirer, how we had to view America. It became more of a melting pot. There was more ethnicities in the country. We were only addressing basically white America at the National Enquirer, just from our roots or bones. So we started expanding beyond that, and we changed the formula up a bit. We changed the celebrities up a bit. And we found out that there were some celebrities that sold that we never would have thought sold. So that's what Pat Ship was talking about in the film. It's similar to what's going on today.
Wait, Mark, do you have any last thing you want to say, since it was your film?
No, just that this is actually what we always dreamed would happen. So I'm so grateful to all of you, because, really at the very beginning, I think in the first meeting that I had with Angus James, who's the producer who first said yes to this film, and I want to thank him right here for this. We talked, thank you. And in my conversations with Jennifer Ashrudy, who's over there, when we met at the net, we talked about this film wanting and needing to pose more questions than it delivered answers. Because who are we to deliver answers? It's a complex issue, and we knew our place in that, and we constantly had to keep ourselves in check. And I think this evening is proof positive that we did what we set out to do, and I'm really grateful for that. So thank you.